Hello, and welcome to this deep dive video that addresses my top 5 questions regarding the first third of this poem, roughly. It takes us all the way to the celebration after the Grendel Beowulf battle. For teachers listening to this, what I generally do during Beowulf, and I break up other texts similarly, is that after a certain chunk of text, we pause and we spend a couple of days, and the students come up in a Google Doc with a list of questions or observations they have about the text. They state the question and then answer it using quotations from the text. They can write in the first person. It's a bit informal, but they do need quotations. And the nice thing about this is throughout the reading of something like Beowulf, they'll have written 3 short little papers based on questions they actually have. So we get together the next day and we have a roundtable conversation simply rooted in their questions. And I do this too. I state a question and give some thoughts. But anyway, that's kind of where we're at right now. So first, and I think when in doubt, you're in the hands of, say, a difficult text. This is always something you can talk about. Zadie Smith, the really great British writer, talks about what texts believe. And what's interesting is that on the surface, Beowulf can look like it's pretty simplistic, that we know what good is, we know what evil is, we know what a king is, we know what God is. So even though that superficially, that it looks that way, let me offer just some thoughts. And by the way, I'm not giving a comprehensive reflection on these questions. I'm not preempting anything you would think or write about. But these are just some things that I wonder about after the beginning. So what does the poem believe about what a good king is? And this is something that I'm not sure about. In the very beginning of the epic, we have Shield Shefson, one of Hrothgar's descendants, and he's a god kuning because he keeps his people safe, he shares his riches and wealth, and he is such an intimidating ruler that neighboring kingdoms pay him tribute so that he won't attack them. And those criteria are the definition of a good king earlier on. But we know that Hrothgar, after he can't protect his people from Grendel for years, is also called a good king. So I would keep an eye on this as maybe something that the poem is evolving in terms of its beliefs of what a good king is. The poem might be changing its mind, and I think that's worth talking about. The nature of evil. Whether or not, even in this very early stage of English literature, we can look at a Shakespearean text like Hamlet or Othello, or we could look at Paradise Lost or Dickens or people like that. But even going all the way back to Beowulf, evil isn't simple. It seems that some characters, like a Grendel, are genetically evil. Their very sort of DNA, to use a modern term, is rooted in the villainy of the past. Characters like Cain, who betrayed the one he was supposed to be most loyal to. So some of the evil looks to be genetic, and that's interesting to think about. And then some of the evil is, choices and behavioral. But I think it's layered. And I think this is something that needs to be continually explored. And I think the poem continually offers different layers of what it thinks about what evil is. Something that's really interesting about Beowulf that may be true, I think it's the case in the Iliad and the Odyssey as well, and I think it's the case just in forward areas in military contexts, that if you promise to do something, people need to rely on you, and their lives are at stake. So there's a moment where Beowulf's men land in Denmark, and in one translation it says, Beowulf's men drop their weapons and they're kind of, in the new environment in Heorot, and it said that their words were as good as their weapons. Their weapons were as good as their words. That what you say you're going to do and what you end up doing need to be need to cohere, one needs to follow from the other, and that's obviously the case in any context, but here the stakes are life and death. So that lying here, not following through here, leads to slaughter. And then, this is certainly interesting when reading classical epic poetry, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid. It's interesting in Paradise Lost. But it's interesting here in a really mysterious way, which is that we have this notion of God's will or providence. And lots of ink has been spilled about whether the poem is Christian or pagan, which one is it. And just to be aware that you should, as a new reader or an experienced reader, feel liberated by the fact that there's an academic article called The Essential Paganism of Beowulf, and there's others called Christian Coloring in Beowulf, Christian Themes in Beowulf. There is no agreement. I think it's the wrong question to ask, actually. Is the poem pagan or Christian? I think it's a really interesting amalgam of both. And you have times where God's will is the thing to bow down to. And you hear Beowulf and Hrothgar talk about that. But then you have, in Headley's translation in sort of rough language, people being screwed over by fate or weird. And it's also important to note that even though Tolkien's translation of Beowulf, which his son published a few years back, is a bit stodgy and difficult to read, the notes at the end are astonishing. They're based on a lifetime of reading and thinking about Beowulf. And he says that weird, which we always translate as fate, actually more accurately means simply what happens. So I mention that because what you have in God is a conscious, controlling, supernatural force. And what you have in weird is simply, not a conscious force, not like the fates in ancient Greece, but rather just an acknowledgement that certain things happen the way they happen, and there may not be a controlling principle around it. So it seems like so far part of heroism is bowing to forces that are bigger than you. And I wonder, is the power of the ring in Lord of the Rings, is that a modern analog to that? Is the Force in Star Wars a modern analog to that? But anyway, this is something to pay attention to as the poem goes on. And then something else the poem believes deeply is the heroic paradox, which is to say that in order to attain immortality, in order to live forever, you have to die heroically. So you have to die to live. That's the paradox. And the Shope, the court poet, is the one who would sing your heroic song forever. So the poets are important for lots of reasons, not the least of which is they're the vehicles of warrior immortality. So it seems like what they feel pretty sure about is this is the way we know people live forever, is that you behave heroically over time and your song is sung forever, and you attain a sort of narrative immortality. So those are some things the poem seems to believe. Secondly, what is Grendel? This question is completely fascinating to me. And it's largely rooted in how people translate certain terms. So I'm just going to dip my toe into the original manuscript a little bit and show you what some of the terms in the manuscript are for Grendel. So we have Elengast. Elen means sort of fierce, and Gast is either creature or stranger. Fierce creature is a sort of neutrally bad name. Stranger is dangerous because in this context, if you're a stranger, you were probably banished for doing something terrible. Then, unlike his mother later, who's affectionately known as Grendel's mother, Grendel has a name. And I was doing some poking around, and there's not a lot of agreement on where this name comes from. It's perhaps from Old English Grindal, which is a word for either fierce or angry. That would make sense. Or Old Norse Grindil, which is storm or wind. Not sure about that. One that seems to come up over and over again is Old English Grindan, which means to grind or to destroy. In other words, how Grendel consumes his enemies, his prey. So we have fierce, angry, storm, wind, grind, destroy. It's just interesting that Grendel's name clearly means something. It's, his name isn't Frank or Ted. His name is connected to who he is. Here's some other terms that are used. Feonda on hele, fiend out of hell. They're all cognates, right? Fiend, hell. Okay, so kind of a theological name. And then in canis cuna, again, es is what used to be there for the possessive apostrophe s. So in canis cuna, in the kin and the family of Cain. So here, that's the Grendel being his DNA sort of being rooted in deception, murder, and evil. And then eotanas, which is just, sort of the word for giant, but its etymology is an Old Norse word, and this is great. So when it's translated as giant, here's what isn't communicated: that the word originally meant giant, monstrous, undead cannibals. So they're giant zombie cannibals. Isn't that way cooler than just giant? So again, just start imagining being in a meat hall, imagining being attacked by a fierce stranger named after maybe the sound he makes as he consumes you, and that he's from hell, and that his DNA is the father of murder, and that he's also called a giant zombie cannibal. But wait, there's more. He's called an elf, which I think we can think of, the Will Ferrell movie. It's not that. They were powerful supernatural beings in Germanic folklore that were a bit scary. Orkneas, which is where Tolkien does get his idea of the orc. And they're usually translated as evil spirit. A lot of the editions of Beowulf I have just gloss this as evil spirit. But it's interesting. Orcus is from the Latin for the underworld, and the Latin god of the underworld is Orcus. So there's a sense of hell in a way, right? And then neos is the Old English word for corpse. So it's sort of like a corpse from the underworld. So evil spirit doesn't really cover that, does it? And then gigantus, there it is, gigantus, obviously cognate for giants. And it was believed that the giants, for example, the giants in the Old Testament, like Goliath, were physically perverse because they were from the moral perversion of Cain. So it was believed, at least in Anglo-Saxon Christianity, that the giants in the Old Testament were tainted physically by their moral connection to characters like Cain. There's more, and this is it. Grimagast, fierce, terrible creature. Okay, pretty good. Wergengastes, an accursed creature. And again, I hate to be an English teacher here, but some of this stuff, fierce and terrible, it seems like that's rooted in a choice in terms of, Grendel's behavior. Accursed, or fiend out of hell, is his own nature that he's born with, which is different than choices. So he's evil both in his DNA and in his behavior. Banan is slayer or murderer, and this is a fascinating one. Angengea, one who goes alone. An is one, solitary one. And being alone in this context usually means that you did something really terrible, because you've been banished from a community. And in fact, we know Grendel's initial motivation for violence is hearing the sounds of community, and it reminds him of what he doesn't have. So anyway, you might want to just take these notes down. This is what Grendel is literally in the book. So if you're wondering, what is Grendel? Here are the words used for him. And I just want to point out how layered this character is. Something that always perplexes me. I do not have an answer for this, and nothing I've read is satisfying. If it's the case that Unferth has killed his own brother, why is he allowed to remain there? Wouldn't he obviously be either executed or banished? And the only answer I have, and it's speculation, I'd be really curious in the comments to hear what you think, is that he was such a good warrior that his martial prowess, his militaristic skill outweighed the one terrible thing he did. We know that Hrunting, the sword he loans Beowulf later, has this amazingly heroic resume in Unferth's hands. So we know that Unferth sits at Hrothgar's feet, which you have to be a warrior in very high standing to do that. Usually that's reserved for like the sons, right, to be the right and the left of the king. But this is fascinating to me. And like I said, he does the thing that is the most evil thing an Anglo-Saxon, or in this case, a Danish warrior could do. He's allowed to remain and be in high standing. And I don't know, I just find that interesting. Fourth, is Hrothgar good Kuning? Is he a good king? The poem says he is. The poem says he is. It might be the case that he's a good king, but Grendel is such a fierce adversary that Hrothgar being a good king doesn't matter. You need a superhero like Beowulf to come and save the day. So Hrothgar being a good king and still losing, in a way, accentuates the heroism of Beowulf. That's my best guess. But the poem seems very anxious for us to believe that no matter what happens, Hrothgar is a good king. And the poem's anxiety on that point, I think, is worth writing and thinking about. And then maybe a really obvious question. What is special about Beowulf? So we meet him, and he's incredibly rhetorically talented. He gets through the Coast Guard. He gets to Hrothgar. He says the right things in the right order. He waits to reveal his name. He makes sure that he connects himself to his king, to a heroic past. We know he speaks honestly of his deeds. We know that he has a strange relationship to Rekka, or that idea that you're alone. He likes to fight alone and do things alone, even though he has a team of people. What's interesting is I was reading Tolkien's notes on this word. Rekka in a lot of Anglo-Saxon poetry, not Beowulf. I'm just trying to think of like The Wanderer, which is a great Anglo-Saxon elegy that is really the first poem about survivor's guilt. I mean, a lot of Vietnam era literature is about survivor's guilt and survivors of the current war in the Middle East. We have a lot of literature that deals with the issue of survivor's guilt. But The Wanderer deals with it, and the survivor is called a Rekka, which is where we get our word wretched. And wretched in this context was alone. You're alone and doomed in your solitude. But Tolkien says that another word that you can use to translate Rekka is hero, which I find fascinating. In other words, if you can survive and manage alone, kind of like Beowulf, Rekka can mean sort of you're a doomed solitary one, probably evil, or heroic. So it's one of those really malleable, flexible words. So anyway, these are just some things I'm wrestling with. I've read and thought about this poem for a long time, and I just need you to know that this poem is cloaked in all kinds of mystery and intrigue. And to me, that's one of the really fun things about reading it and talking about it every year with my students. So tell me what you think in the comments. Tell me your interpretation of things. And I hope this helps. Happy reading.